Hi guys, my name is Andrew. I'm 24 years old. I'm married to a beautiful woman who will soon give birth to our son. Everything is good in my life, except for one thing. When my son is born, my mom won't see him until he grows up. I won't even show her his picture. Maybe you're thinking that my mom is an evil sorceress willing to harm a child? One summer, 12 years ago, I thought so too. At that time, I was in middle school. I lived with my grandmother, and I enjoyed life. I just got my first girlfriend, Angelica. She was really into all sorts of horror films and mystical stories, but that didn't bother me. Everything was fine until the doctors told my grandmother that she needed to be admitted to the hospital for a couple of months. Cripes. Well, there was nothing serious with my granny. The cripes meant that I had to live with my mom. And you see, I had never met her before. For some reason, my mom lived in a neighboring town. Sometimes she sent me gifts and postcards. Sometimes we talked on the phone. Granny told me that my mom was a very serious and busy woman, and that she truly loves me. I was a child. I believed Granny. Mom wasn't going to come pick me up. I wondered why, but my grandmother explained nothing and just repeated that I should always remember my mother loved me very much. Oy, I was a little confused, and Angelica added some fuel to the fire. When I told her everything, she whispered, "Your mother must be a vampire. She can't travel during the day or get very far from her coffin." Ugh, stupid girl. But my meeting with my mom was really strange. She was much taller, thinner, and paler than in her photo. I wanted to hug her, but she pulled away from me. She barely looked at me. While we were driving home from the bus station, she was silent, but I noticed that she was looking at me in the rearview mirror and whispering something quickly with her lips. Damn, Angelica might be right. It was stupid, but instead of joy, I felt fear. When we arrived home, it turned out that my mother really was very busy, but not in the way that I had imagined it. I thought that she worked a lot. And she did, but she worked at home. She was an artist. I asked her to show me her workshop, but she suddenly yelled that I was forbidden to enter there. Then she said that I would find dinner in the kitchen and that my room was on the second floor, and left. I went up to my room, sat on the bed, and tried to clear my head. And then my phone rang. I jumped off my bed from the sound. It was Angelica. She asked if my mom had already drank my blood. I didn't find that funny at all, but I cheerfully said that everything was wonderful and that I had no time because my mother was waiting for me to eat dinner. Angelica hissed, "Beware, little boy," and hung up. Well, since no one was really waiting for me for dinner, I decided to look around. The house was large and somehow gloomy. There was very little light and a lot of dark wood decor. And someone else was watching me from the shadows. I almost screamed when a huge black cat jumped out at me. He slowly moved forward and growled like a dog. I backed away from him all the way to the kitchen, almost falling down the stairs along the way. And once this monster drove me in there, it disappeared into the shadows. The next day, I spent in my room and only made a couple of trips to the fridge, making sure the black beast wasn't around. My mother was in her workshop. When I heard its door open, I rushed down to see her. I couldn't come up with anything else but to complain to her about her cat. But she said, with a strange laugh, without looking at me, "Maybe Boogeyman was scared of you." Scared? Who was scared? In the evening, when I chatted with Angelica, I told her, no, not about my mom, but about Boogeyman. She immediately concluded that he was undoubtedly the servant of my mother, the vampire queen, and advised me, as she said, to use the power of living fire. I laughed, but that night, when Boogeyman wouldn't let me into the kitchen, I found a box of candles in the kitchen and took a few. It worked. I was able to calmly go into the bathroom and return to my room. Already in bed, I remembered that I had left one lit candle in the bathroom, but I didn't feel like walking down the dark hallway again. The sound of a siren woke me up. Flashing lights shined outside the window, and my room was hazy. I wanted to get up and see what happened, but I was very, very dizzy. I heard my mom anxiously calling Boogeyman again and again, and at that moment, the window in my room shattered with a loud bang. I saw a massive figure break into the window and I fainted. Well, you already understand what happened, right? Using the power of fire. I said a real fire. Fortunately, there was more smoke than fire. However, I could have suffocated in the smoke if a fireman hadn't saved me. A fireman! Why was my mom trying to save her cat and not me? That evening, I told Angelica everything. But when she started talking about vampires and human sacrifices, I yelled at her. We had a fight. I threw the phone down and started crying. I was too old to believe in vampires, but too young to not cry at the thought that my mom hated me. The next time I saw her, she suddenly asked me why I didn't go out for a walk. Indeed, why did I decide that I shouldn't leave the house? My mood improved so much that I exclaimed, "Thank you, Mommy," and rushed to the front door. I didn't quite understand what kind of sound came to my ears. It was like a moan of relief. When you're 12, finding friends isn't a problem, and by that evening I was already buddies with 2 neighboring boys. Although they were a little younger than me, they were great guys, and I decided to show them my jewel, a recently released comic about the new Guardians of the Galaxy. I invited them to come in and wait for me in the hall downstairs. I didn't expect anything bad, but I didn't even have time to get to my room when I heard furious screams from the hall. When I leaned over the railing and looked down, I saw that my mom was waving her hands at the frightened boys, driving them away from the house. Bristled Boogeyman snarled behind her back. I didn't leave the house anymore. I didn't want to see those guys by chance, because I would have to apologize and explain to them that my mom was crazy. I did not know what my mother was doing behind the closed doors of her workshop, guarded by Boogeyman laying at the entrance. But when she came out of there and saw me, she tried not to look at me and spoke to me in a very smooth, emotionless voice. Often after this, she, not knowing that I was still watching her, whispered something and made some strange gestures with her hands. I wanted to call my grandmother, but I remembered how she convinced me that my mother was a good person who loved me. Then I called Angelica. When I told her everything, she was silent for a moment, and then firmly said that I would find out what was going on if I entered the so-called workshop. An altar with skulls, a coffin or something, she said. That night, I went downstairs. I scooped up a water jug in the kitchen, and when Boogeyman blocked my path, I splashed him with water. The formidable guard disappeared into the shadows with a resentful cry. The path was clear. Well, it really was an artist's workshop. It smelled strongly of oil paints, and there were a bunch of paintings. I didn't see anything frightening. The paintings were rather gloomy, but nothing special, landscapes, still lifes. But then I saw myself. There were a few fresh paintings with me as a terrible monster, a devourer straight from nightmares. I was so shocked that I rushed to the door and knocked over an easel with a big picture. It fell, swiping a table with paints. I heard my mom's approaching footsteps and realized that it was over for me. I pressed against the wall and closed my eyes. Our conversation was not easy. It started with my hysterical screams. I screamed that she was crazy, but my mom was not crazy. She suffered from pedophobia, a panicked, uncontrollable fear of children, and the reason for this phobia was my birth. She got pregnant with me very, very early, and my biological father was a really bad person. She didn't want a child and was afraid to give birth, but her mother, my grandmother, forced her to keep the child. She was sure that a child was always a joy, but for my mom, this was not the case. She was depressed when she was pregnant, and after my birth, her life turned into hell. She didn't hate me or other children, no. She experienced a mortal fear. My grandmother didn't want to admit that all this was real, so she had a fight with her granddaughter, took me, and left. Mom was left alone, with her fear and a whole world full of children. Everything that scared me could be explained. Mom whispering to herself, it was an auto-training that helped her keep the fear under control. She did yoga, trying to cope with the panic from my presence. Pictures were also part of the therapy. Firefighters forbade her from opening the door to my room so that the air draft wouldn't increase the fire. They had already put a ladder up to my window, so I was out of danger. She was worried about her son and was trying to save, at least, her cat. We spent the days before my departure as friendly as possible, when one person is terrified of another. We even had dinner together, silently, sitting back to back, but together. And I became buddies with Boogeyman. A few years later, when I became visibly older, I visited my mom again. We were both tense. But suddenly, she rushed to me and hugged me, not letting go of me for a long time. She was no longer afraid of me. Since then, I often come to see her, alone or with my future wife, Angelica, who sometimes jokingly calls my mom the Vampire Queen. But my mother isn't offended. She loves us.